Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Monroe Live. Jordan Arocha here. I'm with Kevin Hardy, and we are going to be walking through a few things on the Rivian. So we just today started getting the fascia components off, getting the lighting off, and so we're able to see some of the skeletal structure underneath. And so we'll be talking about a couple of things. We'll be talking about some of the structural integration that we're seeing, how they sort of decided to place some of their elements cross car, fore aft. We'll be speaking to a few things that we're seeing that to us are architecturally unique or specific to this vehicle. Speaking more specifically about separate subframes, a body-on-frame truck that's debatable whether or not it's body-on-frame in terms of its isolation, and how that manifests into some different characteristics that we're seeing here under hood and under some of the skins. So maybe to get us started, Kevin, why don't you start with some of the observations in terms of cross-car structure and
Sure.
how they sort of carried those load paths across.
So we'll probably maybe start from here and then work a little bit forward. I'm trying to think, a few years ago when we first saw like the Rivian kind of come out and they kind of showed its skateboard platform, one of the things that stood out to me was the shock towers themselves. If you look at, any body-on-frame truck, they have kind of like a very simple deep drawn stamping that is typically used to package both the shock absorber, the overall damper assembly, and then they kind of piggyback the upper control and mounts off this. When you look at this shock tower, it's very indicative of a car, and it's one thing that I thought was interesting when I saw it from the get-go. Obviously, when manufacturers show off various parts of skateboards or platforms, they can omit, different parts of the body structure or anything like that. So I wasn't really sure what we actually would get once we got the R1T here in the building. But I was a little surprised in some way, I suppose, to see that it was body on frame with the shock towers. And then not only is it body on frame, that it's fixed. There's no isolation between the cab and the frame itself. But these shock towers, in part because of the suspension, its travel, and like the capabilities that it delivers to the customer, is extremely high. It's very similar to a car. Typically, if we were looking at like any other truck, an F-150, a Ram, ratio-wise, the top of the shock tower would be roughly here. But when we look at this and how deep and like the overall size and volume that this shock tower occupies because of where the upper control arms mount and the overall travel, I think it's driving a lot of what we're seeing cross-car and a lot of the structure in the vehicle itself. So Kevin,
when you say car, you're saying a unibody construction versus a body-on-frame.
Yeah,
the body-on-frame.
It's like a hybrid between the two.
Right.
And then you're seeing what we would call like a FESM or front-end structural module, upper load beam coming down here, and then it's going to the frame itself. And then we have a nice kind of cross-car brace, which is piggybacking on some other aspects of HVAC mounting, the 12-volt system and things of that nature. But this is very unique, and I've never actually really looked at that in depth into like a Honda Ridgeline. It's a little bit different as far as how those front-wheel drive architectures and their cowl kind of integrate between the two, but there realistically is nothing else on the market that is kind of structured like this. And I think it's driving kind of a lot of the unique execution that we're seeing here and we're going to talk about in this video with how much integration there is going across. And I think that's probably needed because of loads that this shock tower probably sees both off-road and on-road because of the performance that this vehicle can deliver. And in some ways, its weight. It's a very heavy vehicle. And you kind of have to fight some of that mass. It scales into every system, and you have to manage that. So
yeah. So maybe now looking at some of the additional structures cross car, right? When I look at this, I see enough structure here to me to indicate that you probably don't even need a cradle or a subframe, meaning a separate element bolted to the underside of this in a conventional setting, right? So what I'm saying is the amount of structure here on a body-on-frame application, this would typically be it structurally, right? With the amount of structural sections that we're seeing cross-car that are really tying this thing in and creating some structural hoops. It's quite robust, and we're seeing that manifest in terms of the scales, right? Coming in at over 7,000 pounds, giving that it's a little bit smaller than a F-150. and the F-150 is lighter, the Lightning that just came out, even when fully loaded. So we're seeing some redundant structures. It's a first off of something from a company. So hats off to Rivian for getting a vehicle into production. Huge feat, but with that, we're seeing some elements that tell us that they're struggling with structure and efficiency more specifically, and getting some of the weight out of this car. And so I think some of this may be due to kind of trying to figure out how they want to set up an architecture, and I think some of it may be due to simply trying to get something into production versus taking a step back and looking more towards weight optimization, right? If you've ever done FEA or failure effect analysis, you'll see when the model is blue, that means it's more than structural enough. And when things start going yellow, red, orange, all those other colors of the rainbow, more specifically red, that means, well, we probably have an issue that we need to address. So if I were to guess at what their FEA looks like in some of these areas, ignoring the weld fidelity, I would say that they're extremely blue, right? They're being conservative about some of these structural elements.
Yeah, I would agree. And there's a couple other things that kind of to take into account. I have a lot of friends that have left their current jobs and have gone to work for Rivian. And maybe as it pulls talent from so many other industries, so many other companies, managing some of that is difficult. And that's something that, Tesla has been in business for a little while. They've kind of worked through some of those issues from like programs and architectures and managing how you build vehicles, best practices, things of that nature. And this is Rivian's first go. And I think in some ways we see the kind of the traces of that with some of the complexity and some of the decisions that were made here. I don't want to throw stones at anything, so to speak, because we're not in those meetings. We don't see the functional objectives that they might be chasing or whatever they're trying to deliver and give to the customer or deliver on time or within a certain period of time. If you give any engineer enough time, they'll figure it out eventually, but that's at some point you have to deliver a vehicle, get it sold, and start making money.
So maybe let's go a little bit further forward in the vehicles and kind of talk about what we see here. So we've got an overmolded steel front end module or carrier. So that's this piece right here. So this is supporting the front grille, the headlamps, portion of the fascia. On the backside, it's supporting aspects of the frunk to include the latch mechanism. So right here is where the frunk is going to close and latch into. I'll be honest, looking at how this front end is set up in terms of the end user and the ability to access the frunk, I was hoping for better ingress or kind of a wider berth at the front of the vehicle, and more specifically lower, right? And I'm not the tallest individual, but regardless, if you look at some of the industry competitors, right, the Lightning was just released, and if you've seen images of that, the entrance to the frunk, or that ingress point in the Z-axis, so vertically, is dramatically lower than it is on this vehicle. And that's because a lot of the stuff that we're seeing here is actually on the hood on the Lightning versus being hard mounted to the front end structure of the vehicle. So yes, that makes your hood a little bit heavier, and there's certainly some things that you need to manage there. But from my perspective anyways, if the F-150, the Lightning, was able to do it, which is an adaptation to an internal combustion engine platform, I was hoping to see that on a dedicated BEV platform like the Rivian, that we would see a better front entrance. As Kevin mentioned, of course, we have no idea what their functional objectives were and some of the requirements when building this. But regardless, I think there's some things that they could do, and they may very well be working on it to improve that whole dynamic, And as we look inside, so a little bit forward of this on the other side of the FEM, we're seeing some specific elements to accommodate the frunk. The cooling module right here, so it's the radiator, condenser, fan motor, is put on an angle to improve the packaging space here. We've seen that on the Model S. From the underbody shots, I believe the Lightning is like that also, but just in the other direction. So they are moving through some cooling pack hurdles. The other thing that I saw with regard to the cooling pack is that it's all stick built, right? So we've got a rather substantial front end module. We've got a pretty large bumper, crosscar beam right here, specifically for impact and some of the recovery hook elements. But the cooling module itself on a conventional application is typically PIA, or part in assembly, to a larger module that can get brought to the final assembly line. Here it's separate. So that means that there's additional fasteners and elements that need to interface the two, right, dedicated to it. It's not, the fasteners are not serving as many functions as on other vehicles, right? It's all self-contained, and many times they snap into one another. So not a lot of fasteners. But there is absolutely a lot going on here. So I get some of what they did in terms of packaging. As you move down, right, you're seeing they've got some active grille shutters, right, to improve aero when you need it, open it up so that the radiator breathes a little bit more as you need it. But, you know, Kevin, when we were talking yesterday, you were pointing out some of the complexity just in the recovery hook, and it just leads you to believe, I think, that they're getting there, but they've got a ways that they could go in terms of optimizing some of the part complexity. Maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, arguably, it's probably the most complex tow hook I've ever seen. I know there's a lot of aspects that are supposed to be aesthetic and deliver on that. They're also not standard. What I am seeing, though, at a high level, I haven't really checked the part numbers, but it looks like both assemblies are common, which is nice. But essentially, we have two cast nodes here. We have a Class A hook feature that is, it appears to be, I can't really get my finger in to see, but it looks like it's wrapping around, which makes the most sense to me from a load case perspective, and then it's being retained in place for assembly. With two fasteners here. You have four fasteners bolting these two cast end caps into the bumper beam assembly, and then two stamped closeouts, which appear to be common. And then again, these assemblies seem to be mirrored on both sides, which is nice, but it's still a lot of parts. On many other trucks, like we'll bring up the Lightning, for instance, it's probably carryover from the F-150. It is just a simple U-bolt forming with another U-bolt stamped piece underneath it, and then it has two bolts that go to the frame, which have some slip provisions for impact. So when they hit, the tow hooks will essentially ingress in the body and shear off, which I think is why we have these clearance passages here and these two bolts here. So for the same exact thing, you get an accident, this assembly will shear and then drive the hooks into the bumper and allow energy to be absorbed. Where in an impact, where in a recovery situation, you start pulling on this and you need the strength going frontward in some vehicles. So.
Yeah, there's, to that point, in terms of getting things to shear and creating some space for energy absorption, something that we work with our clients on a pretty regular basis on is looking at like vehicle pulse index. And so what they're talking about is during a frontal impact event, whether it be small overlap rigid barrier, which is just 25% of the vehicle, full frontal, so the entire front, 40% offset. There's many variations of impact testing that you would do. But one of the key things that you want to pick up on and address is how many hard points, meaning things that will not compress and collapse within the whole front area of the vehicle. So anywhere between the occupants and the front of the vehicle are there. Where are those going to stack up? How are those going to stack up? Because those all contribute to that VPI, or vehicle pulse index. So the better the index, the better the results, and ultimately the safety scores will be as far as how the vehicle performs from a crashworthiness perspective. So, you know, although it may just look like something is bolted in or there's a weird shape in it, many of those things are very highly engineered elements of the vehicle with regard to safety.
You almost literally see that with this bulkhead here going straight down so obviously the frunk is being packaged here, but when you look at the amount of content, essentially immovable objects from a crush perspective with these, all the electronic high voltage modules, you have the EAC, brake booster, looks like a 2-box system here, the 12-volt batteries, all that stuff is not conducive to crashing or compressing in a crash environment. Where down here in the bottom, the frunk is relatively open. We have the cooling pack, which will essentially fold rearward, and then you have your ABS module and a series of other modules which have some space to move rearward in vehicle before you start getting to the shock towers and other major monuments where you're trying to protect the occupants. But it's interesting to see, essentially, there's frunk aside, there's a very literal wall created of essentially components being packaged.
And since we're on this sort of vein of talking about impact and crashworthiness, we may as well talk about their SORB package. So it's interesting. So again, to reiterate, SORB is small overlap rigid barrier. So they measure 25% of the overall vehicle width. That will get run into quite literally a rigid barrier that will not move during the event. And so the goal is to either, whether it's an offensive or defensive strategy, to get the vehicle to glance off of the barrier so that the vehicle doesn't need to do as much in the way of energy absorption. Or a defensive strategy would be essentially at some point between the front and the rear, even if the vehicle doesn't glance at all, to be able to absorb enough energy between the barrier and the safety cell or the occupant home such that the occupants in the vehicle are unharmed. So looking at this vehicle, there's a few telltales that you would look at to say, well, is it offensive or defensive? To me, there's some very similar characteristics that I would see on a Volvo XC90, for example. The XC90, and if you've followed Volvo, they've always been very safety focused. They do some things up front with their bumper beams and their side rails to enable a more offensive package. So if you were to kind of squint your eyes and look at how the vehicle reacts from the front of the vehicle during an impact before it gets to the hinge pillar, they're trying to create a structural ramp, right? So you want that glide off of the barrier to be as smooth and as consistent as possible. So what's going on here in the front bumper is it's already angled. So just based on the geometry, they're already enabling that direction of movement, meaning as this starts to crush, given its geometry, they're already allowing that to swing inboard. And you'll notice there's a standoff plate welded to the back side of it. So what's going to happen in an impact environment is this thing is going to swing all the way over here and interface with this piece right here. So there's like an angled bracket or a gusset here. And so when that stacks up, there's enough structure cross car. This is a reinforced stamped steel closed section. It's a very strong and rigid part. There's enough structure here so that when that thing reaches a point of stack up, it's going to start to actually move the vehicle away from what's pushing up against it. And we're seeing the same characteristic just rearward of that. So if you look inside here, they've got these big triangular sections just outboard of the rail. And if you think about a ramp, you kind of look for triangles in some of these geometries, right? So it's much wider at the back end than it is at the leading end. So we're talking about the gap between the rail and the section. So the vehicle's already in a ramped movement given what we saw in the front bumper. As it moves rearward, they're going to use that section, that tower right there, to continue that ramp and move rearward. And if you look vertically, the outboard side of that box aligns almost perfectly with the top leading edge of this, which we would call either an upper load beam or a shotgun assembly. So from the first point of contact in the vehicle all the way to the shotgun and rearward, they're trying to get this vehicle as far away from the barriers they can get it. And typically, if you can execute on an offensive strategy well, in terms of glancing off the barrier, that's ideal, right? The defensive packages, a lot of times you're adding some weight to the vehicle. You got to beef up that front end just at the trailing edge of the wheel. And also they typically want to pivot. So they hit the barrier and they pivot away approximately 90 degrees from your original direction of travel, which from a secondary impact perspective, if someone's adjacent to you or behind you, following you, you kind of expose yourself to more of a T-bone environment. So interesting execution, but there is a lot of material used to generate this. And
to kind of build off what you're saying, Eric, if we can just come over and take another like plane view looking straight down. So when you're engaging this, you know, why SORB is so catastrophic is essentially you're bypassing your primary load rails. And then this part here, so you have these kind of bird beak features for crush initiators. So this is all starting to intrude, you know, in vehicle length here. Compressing, this starts to rotate, the barrier is coming in here, and it's interesting where the placement of this crossmember. I'd love to see this vehicle run digitally just to see kind of what's going on here for sure. And
I don't think it's an accident, right?
Yep, and hopefully we'll get a chance to see one actually physically run. But essentially now you have this huge monument that's engaging and reacting against both the main motor bay rail here and also moving across crosscar here. And there's definitely a lot of emphasis, paid to both the body structure and this car all throughout it. One of the things I think is very, very unique to this is, in some ways, the frame of this vehicle is built like a unibody vehicle with a series of layered, stamped, and spot welded panels. Then they're brought together, MIG welded. You can see here that these are probably touch-up MIG welds coming back in, so you have very nice, clean robotic welds coming through, and then maybe some concern that they have, and they come in and touch it all up. But this rail itself is also splayed going outwards towards the kind of critical impact zone area. On some of the older vehicles, like the old Subarus, they didn't add much for small overlap because their rails were so splayed because of their flat four that they had in the motor. And to get them compliant didn't cost Subaru a lot of money because they were kind of naturally, architecturally well suited for it.
Right.
So,
yeah, I don't know. Overall, when I look at the front of the vehicle, there's some things I like, some things I don't like, but it does kind of very, very quickly to me when I look at this, I think it is a low volume, high cost application given the amount of seemingly sort of redundant structures fore aft. There's a lot of structure in very similar areas that I think there's ways to optimize. You may not be able to get rid of all of it, but I think there's ways to optimize and get the same effect while reducing weight, reducing costs via the material and so forth, but simple things. Right, when we look at the harness and we've got a overmolded stamped steel front end structural module, they're not taking advantage of the fact that if you're overmolding this and you've got electrical connectors, sensors, hoses, cables, different things that are ductile in front of it, you can mold in features so that you can snap these right in. So every one of these first needs to be installed to the harness. By these I mean the push pins here. So you need to wrap it around the harness. Then you need to bring the whole harness in and snap it to the vehicle. Here, we had they could have had an opportunity to snap this into an injection molded piece, but instead now we're using fasteners. So little things like that, they may seem trivial, but if you look at the entire vehicle, they'll start to add up very quickly. And so I think if we were to communicate directly to Rivian, I would say, hey, let's take a look at some of these things. Let's tweak some tools. Actually, it would be a whole new tool for the front of this in terms of the overmold. But over time, I think they could amortize that cost and get some of that back.
Yeah. And if this wasn't a kind of first out of the gate vehicle, and let's say this has been in production for 10 years, when you look at even the packaging of some things, like the clearances on some things are very tight, kind of maybe too tight when you look at some of the lines here for the suspension. Granted, it is a fixed body going to a frame here if you want to come around. And it's pretty tight here. There's very little gap kind of going around. It is fixed. The body structure and frame are fixed. It's not like it's isolated, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is if this was around longer, we would be using this vehicle as an example to challenge maybe some other clients' packaging requirements if they're exceedingly conservative. There's a lot of interesting things here that suggest that, again, it's a new company that may not have a ton of legacy constraints behind it, which is sometimes a huge enabler. Other times, you just don't know what you don't know. But overall, I mean, I like from the structural bones perspective and where the load paths are going, I think it is well executed, but I'm not sure, especially as the frame kind of comes down to where the rocker, where the battery interface is, I'm not sure there's a vehicle on the market that doesn't have a series of more overlapping panels than this one. It's pretty substantial. So. Yeah,
and so as we move into the next videos, when we separate the body and rolling chassis, we'll really dive into how those things are interfaced. Having a hard-mounted frame to a unibody, to me, says there's some inefficiencies that could be improved upon. There's a reason that you do a body on frame that's isolated. The isolation gives you some innate benefits. So to do a body on frame and then hard mount it and then have subframes below it, we'll have to dive into it a little bit more as we tear it down. But I think they've got some area for opportunity. But all in all, very cool. They've got a lot of feature content. I'm pleased to see that some of the lines on the interior, like some of the thermal management and cooling, is well routed. So we'll dive into that in the coming videos. But I just want to thank everyone for taking the time, watch the video, and as Corey would say, if you get a chance, go ahead and subscribe. We'll see you next time. Thank you.